All right, welcome everybody to the Sprint Jump Throw Performance Podcast. Happy to have you on this week, Dr. Ken Clark. He's at Westchester University, as well as does a lot of work with United States Track and Field, and you've probably seen his research all over the place. So thanks for doing this, Doctor.
Yeah, really excited to be here and talk shop with you guys. And please call me Ken. And look forward to speaking with you and talking all things speed.
Sweet. All right, we'll dive right in. So we touched on it briefly beforehand, but one of the things that it was on Twitter recently, you were doing a presentation for Jonas Dodu's what's what I'm looking for, internship, and you got into a little bit of like running too pretty or being too front side and how that can lead to just kind of spinning the wheels, and it might look nice in a slow-mo Instagram video, but then in reality, is it actually getting you from A to B faster? So I guess we can go several different ways with this, but maybe like, what do you see as potentially like the route to which somebody gets to the point where they're, quote, running too pretty, and then how do we then peel them back out of it?
Yeah, great question. Happy to discuss this topic. I love social media and Twitter, although sometimes 140 characters is not enough to fully give justice to a topic. So yeah, for context, that clip from the virtual internship with Jonas and Speedworks, was kind of presented in a range of things to be looking for, and so I kind of had gone from team sport athlete or developmental sprinter, and all of the issues that you kind of see with them that we're probably fully aware of, bad posture, bad backside mechanics, and we can certainly get into those issues as well. And then kind of was just touching upon something that we've seen only at the very elite end of the spectrum, with a small portion of our USA track and field population, but it does exist. And I'd say in maybe a quarter of our elite men, and I'm talking like the guys who make it to semis and finals at the national championships. In practice, we see that they're what I would call just a little bit overly front side, where the mechanics are losing something on the propulsive side of things during ground contact, where maybe they're just kind of cycling in place, perhaps a little bit too much. Great as far as not having any limb swing back behind them during the flight phase. Great as far as the touchdown position. Arguably they're too forward upon initial ground contact. And I think it's just a happy medium of certainly not wanting to be overly backside, and we'll get to that. I mean, that is still, where one doesn't want to be, but just finding a good balance of having the mechanics shifted appropriately front side and not overdoing anything. In the wake of that Twitter post, I had a number of really productive conversations with people saying, well, isn't this just a very small number of people that you're seeing it in? And isn't front side mechanics still something that you want to generally encourage? And the answer to both of those questions is a resounding yes. I mean, this is just in a very, very small percentage of the elite population that perhaps where it's getting overdone, you could say, to the detriment perhaps of some other things. I appreciate the opportunity to kind of discuss it more in depth here by saying, hey, if I'm working with a team sport athlete or a developmental sprinter, like our sprinters at Westchester, I can absolutely say we've never seen that. There's never been a case where the person is just, too front side, right? So for almost everyone that I think that's involved in team sports or developmental sprinters, you're always going to be encouraging them to try to shift their mechanics more front side. It was more something that had just come up that was interesting, out of the emphasis on front side mechanics that's really been focused on at the elite level through the influence of Ralph Mann, and and deserving of all the praise that he gets. And I've had a chance to work with Ralph for the last 5 years, and he's had a tremendous impact on me. It's been a great experience. But even, Ralph had made the observation that at least in a small percentage of population of the U.S. men, it's getting kind of overdone. So that was kind of the context of that little clip on Twitter. And, you know, again, as you said, Joel, we can go a bunch of different directions with this conversation. It'll be interesting. I think, you know, in those runners where maybe it's happening just a little bit too much in practice, you know, it's just knowing that they're, you know, trying to emphasize, hey, be in front, so far in front with everything they do, just at the risk of not pushing or projecting enough, frankly. And you know, hey, the emphasis has still got to be on running fast. If it's a rep where you're, you know, going for a full speed trial, right? Obviously, there's a lot of reps where maybe it's a sub-maximal run, or there's other things that are the goal. But if you're going all out, that's the goal of the trial, then, you know, finding a happy medium, I think, is key in that elite population. So
Yeah. Yeah, the post spark, like, it made me think in my head, because I knew it was in the like elite population, where these guys, without focusing on it, are gonna be in almost, you know, kind of the picture perfect theoretical model. And so when they super focus on it, they go to the extreme potentially. But then in my head, I was thinking about it when those same concepts, I see it pop up in field sport athletes, where if you're in sort of, you know, maybe not super backside, but more backside than you would like to see, and we're trying to get them more front side. I've seen ways where it's like, if you bring, I don't know, the easy way to say it is like, if it's postural issues and they're focusing on fixing it just simply by volitional leg activity without actually fixing the postural issues, then you see it's not, if you just watch a video of it, you wouldn't say, oh, that's too front side. It's much more front side than they were, but then you don't see it carry over into a competitive setting where they're not actively thinking about it. Does that make sense?
it does. And I think, you know, kind of a broader, really interesting question is the difference between what we see and what the goal is in practice versus what's observed in competition, you know, and kind of what the goal mechanics are in competition. And then also, you know, what the difference is between practice and competition mechanics. So if we start with track and field, because I think that's always a little easier, you know, obviously 100-meter sprinters don't have to worry about a ball or somebody coming to tackle them in the middle of the sprint, right?
Yeah.
Whereas a football or soccer player would, you know, I still don't think there's any sprinter in competition where we look at their mechanics and we're like, oh, they're too front side in competition, right? So it's definitely an understanding of, hey, what they do in practice, you know, needs to be at X, you know, model with a certain amount of bandwidth, knowing that they're going to, you know, that the mechanics are going to become a little bit, you know, less fit to the model in a competition scenario in almost every athlete that we've observed, right? And then with team sport athletes, you know, I think it comes down to trying to get them to hit the positions that are, you know, we would consider technically sound when they're sprinting in practice, knowing that in a game situation, the constraints of the game are going to change what they look like, whether it's because they're wearing pads and a helmet for football, whether it's because they're, you know, chasing a soccer ball, but may have to put on the brakes, you know, to change direction. I mean, the constraints of the game are just going to change those mechanics, you know, in almost every case in a game situation. I guess my thought on this has always been that, number one, in our team sport athletes, I guess if we shift the conversation there for a minute,
yeah,
we want to teach them the right way to sprint, you know, just so they can sprint better in practice, so they can sprint more safely in practice, so we can expose them to a greater stimulus with a at least theoretically decreased risk of injury. I mean, number one, chasing the stimulus, which I view as a good thing, is the first and foremost reason to teach proper mechanics. And you know, hopefully we get a performance bump along with that they can run faster, you know, because we've taught them proper mechanics. And then if we get, you know, even a slight degree of carryover to a game, if the posture or the pelvic position is even slightly better in a game situation, I mean, then it's a win-win, right? If the wide receiver catches a long pass and it's, you know, it's a race to the end zone, and we can even see that the mechanics have just, you know, the posture and the pelvis and the, you know, the leg swing is even slightly more front side, then to me, then that's what we're looking for. All the while understanding that, hey, if the running back is, you know, in the hole and then cutting and changing directions to avoid the linebacker, Well, of course, when they initially break into the sprint from that point, it's not going to look like a sprinter, at the 60-meter mark or the 100-meter dash. So I think just trying to keep those two things in mind is really key, at least, from my perspective. What do we want them to look like in practice? Like what model are we teaching them towards in practice? And then what changes, should we expect in a competition scenario, whether that's 100-meter sprinter in a race or whether that's a football, soccer, player in a game, so to speak. So
Yeah. And I've even like seeing, I know I've done a fair amount where it's like I'm sitting at football practice and I just like take slow-mo videos on my phone of like receiver get offs or something like that.
yep,
And recognizing that, especially if there's a defender right there, like hip height, that's the biggest thing in like sports versus like just running on a track is like, you have to like, oh, I'm about to get hit or I'm about to kick a ball or whatever.
yep,
So you end up just being a little more squatty.
sure.
Um, but if we can be a little more squatty because of the constraints of the game, but we're able to just like overall control our pelvis a little bit better, like I see that as like that's where I've gotten athletes to like click like, oh, okay, I feel that, like, hey, if you don't, I guess could be a quick transition to we talked about it briefly, but it's the reason that Boo doesn't like wickets. But is like if you're not getting front side at all because you have no control over your pelvis, and then you're simply focused on like, oh, I'm gonna get my knees up in front without addressing the true pelvic issues, then then when you're not thinking about the knees, it can kind of bleed away in terms of the pelvic control.
Yeah,
In terms of
absolutely. I mean,
yeah, attacking that
posture and
pelvic
the pelvis
control.
are key.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are your like go-tos when you're like in a practical setting when it's like, all right, I'm trying to attack pelvic control in, that anterior posterior plane. What are your kind of go-tos for that?
Yeah, I've had some really interesting conversations with Jordan Mendegucci over the last 6 months or so, and I consider Jordan from Spain, one of the foremost experts on this, just as far as working both with athletes and patients in the clinic, and also having a research background, and he's influenced my thinking just in a way that it's not just enough to try to work on technique or mechanics, but really need some sort of integrated approach where the physios or whoever else from the sports med team is working with the athlete in the clinic, on the training table, et cetera, to address whatever limitations they might have from flexibility, mobility, strength, stability, weakness, and in combination with that, being addressing it from a technical standpoint, when you're working on running mechanics. And maybe that's nothing, that's no big revelation, and maybe that's more just common sense, right? But it takes, I think an integrated approach probably to really make optimal changes in athletes, because I think especially in our team sport athletes, just if I take my researcher hat off and just put my coaching hat on, I mean, observationally, so many of them do have, probably some sort of physical limitations that are causing them, especially American football guys, right? I mean, as we all know, to be, the majority of them are anterior pelvic tilt due to some sort of, lack of flexibility. And if they physically can't get into that, pelvic position, to a large degree, any type of drill, cue, et cetera, that you throw at them could be limited in its success if that's the only way you address it. So, I guess in a more theoretical perspective, I'd say, well, you have to, optimally address both kind of whatever their limitations are and where you're, where you're cueing them, what drills you're doing with them. I'll speak to one specific football player that I train over this. I know I've had a lot of conversations with a physical therapist, a DPT that I work with, who also works with this athletes, and we're just constantly talking about the pelvic tilt of this athlete, and hey, how can we address this? Not just in how we're cueing it. I do like wickets. There's many good coaches who don't, right? That's a different discussion for a different time, or maybe for this time, I don't know, right? Many great coaches don't use them. Many great coaches do. I do happen to like them, but those have been one thing we've used with this athlete, but it's it's not just drills. I think there's cues, drills, and I think it also has to be addressed with, within the limitations that the athlete has from a physical standpoint. I'm not sure if I answered your question or not, but I think that's the broader picture. And I think that's the way it's going, right? With sports
Yeah.
science, sports med, and strength and conditioning is this integrated approach where it's not just the track coach or the S&C coach and then the PT and the ATC are doing something different. I mean, it's got to be this blended approach, I think. So
Yeah, no doubt. If you're trying to just, if the door frame is off, it doesn't matter how hard you try to slam the door, it's not going in.
right,
Yeah, for sure. So I
absolutely.
mean, we can go right into that now if you want. It's like
Sure.
when you utilize like wickets, what are you looking for from like a landmark standpoint, and how do you try to influence the athlete's attention while doing them to get the most out of it?
Yeah, so I'll give a shout out to my friend and colleague Jason Kilgore, who's the head track and field coach at Westchester. The majority of my experience using wickets has come as a volunteer assistant sprints coach at Westchester. So when I say that's who I'm referring to. Just kind of what we do with our speed and power athletes at Westchester with wickets. So we try to take I guess you could say, a targeted approach for. Many of our athletes will do, this year is a totally different scenario. In a normal non-COVID year, kind of fall preseason testing where just simple videotape and timing gates and video analysis where we know stride rate, stride length, top speed, segment time, contact time, flight time, just kind of those basic analyses. And from that, you can get some measures of contact distance, the distance the center of mass travels during the ground contact phase. And so that can kind of give you a pretty good picture of what the athlete does with their normal top speed mechanics, right? So normally for us, that's in September. It didn't happen this year, but that's normally in September. And then so when we implement wickets and we don't do anything rocket science, we've traditionally used Vince Anderson spacings. Sometimes Ron Grigg, who also has excellent spacings and is a friend and a colleague, we've used his variations as well. But we just we have a lot of different options. And again, I don't think anything I'm saying is reinventing the wheel here, but we'll set up six lanes or so and just match the end of the wicket run, the last 3-4 wickets in the lane to what we know that the athlete's free sprint stride length is. So we can basically what I would term as a targeted approach. So you're not just throwing darts at a dartboard and saying, hey, this athlete might work here or that could work there, but okay, well, they're going to be pretty close to their top speed towards the end of this run. And then, that should work out much better if we have the wicket length set to basically what approaches their normal stride length on in a free sprint. We found kind of through experience over the last couple of years that athletes can run really fast at wicket lengths that are 95, 97, 100% of their free sprint stride length. So we did do an official study on that 3 years ago at this point. We're still in the process of writing that up. And we found fly times through the wickets that were very fast after we had coached the athletes for like a 5-6 week period. So I'm not saying you can just take athletes and throw them into wickets and, first rep, it's a go. Nothing like that. But, we tested athletes in October, middle of October, after they had a 6-week period of learning how to run through wickets. And we found that we could get them running really fast with good mechanics. Now, back to your original question, Joel. I know I just took like 5 minutes to not answer a question. That's how we use them. So I'll get to my team sport athletes, I guess, in a second. What we look for is really nothing special aside from, I guess, what you would consider, the normal checklist of good top speed mechanics. So upright posture, basically neutral hips, not reaching. That's clearly the number one thing in wickets, is making sure that they're not reaching to hit the stride lengths in the wickets, but that they can basically step over, push down, or attack the ground, or however you want to say it. And that, it looks like they're continuing to build momentum throughout the course of the wicket run, just qualitatively to your coach's eye, that they're, not stepping out, not reaching out towards the end of the run. So that's kind of, what we look for. As far as what we cue, again, from my experience, at least with our Westchester sprinters, it's when the run doesn't go well, it's because they don't accelerate aggressively enough into the wickets. So actually, that's the thing we end up coaching the most, I found, is just, hey, those first 7 steps, that's got to be an aggressive maximal acceleration into the wickets to allow them to continue to build momentum throughout the course of the wickets. And then if you check that box, if the acceleration into the wickets is aggressive, then they can build momentum and can continue to push their way through the wickets, as opposed to having the momentum die out. And then that's where they tend to step and reach, and that's where things kind of go haywire a little bit. So I guess for transparency, I certainly don't claim to be the best coach out there. There are many other people who are better coaches than I am. But I think, my experience with those wickets is, just kind of what I've seen, Westchester, what's worked for us, what hasn't worked for us, and I think where they can be beneficial. So with the team sport athletes, I think it's a little bit different because a lot of times you have many more gross things that you need to change. And so I think I've had it not work with team sport athletes, where I've done it and said, you know what, this just is not really being effective for us. It's just not really been a good use of our time. And then I'll just go back to technical flies, which are one of my favorite things to do with team sport athletes. I've also had it work where it's like, okay, I cannot enact a change with this athlete, just cueing or doing other drills. But when they, force this athlete to run through wickets, it seems to help. So I think, for me, it can be effective. It's maybe more a little bit athlete dependent from my experience. So.
Gotcha. So you just said technical flies. What do you, I guess I've never seen.
Yeah, it's my own term. So if you haven't heard it before, that's probably it's just a buildup. Okay. I mean, it's just a fly, but the only reason I would call it that or coin a phrase or whatever is, I don't know, just from the athletes I've worked with, if you're trying to get a change to occur, if you do a full speed fly, they just tend to gun it, right? They're just trying to hit the fastest fly 10 times they can. And sometimes that's, especially in team sport athletes, not with the best mechanics. Things get sloppy at 100%. Whereas if you just kind of back it up a little bit and you tell the athlete, you instruct them, hey, this is it, 90-95%. Or for athletes who aren't good with the percentages, you just say, hey, this is just a little bit less than full speed. Whatever full speed is, you just back that up. And you have them focus on just one thing. So, hey, you're building up, during the fly zone, it's just a little bit less than full speed. And I just want you focusing on, up tall or hips tall or, in front. Sometimes, I like to cue just up tall and in front, or, tall and in front, just to emphasize kind of the posture and the front side mechanics. Again, just totally speaking from an observational basis and experience here, that sometimes is pretty effective. The athlete relaxes a little bit, literally and figuratively, when they know that they're not being judged on that fly time. Still time it, but, they know that they're not going for a PR. It enables them to focus on just, one thing. From a motor learning standpoint, we know that if you guide their attention to too many things, obviously they'll focus on none. So just telling them to focus on one thing. And then ironically, and I think this is true with team sport athletes, but a lot of developmental sprinters as well. If you tell them not to run at full speed, ironically, the times are still very fast. Maybe not their best, but damn close. For athletes, like let's say they run a 10-yard fly for a football guy, for example, that's a 1 flat 10-yard fly when he's doing it all out, that on a technical fly that's at 95%, that'll still be like a 103. It ends up being like 102, 103, like really approaches full speed even without the 100% intent. And so to me, it's a good plan B, if you will, if the wickets don't work for that athlete. That's still a really good strategy. And sometimes we'll do those at the end of our warm up on top speed days as well.
Yeah. And even too, I think I remember Cam Joss posting about this at some point, or maybe it was a podcast. I heard him talking about it, but he had like some super tension monsters who actually ran or PR'd their fly 10 when he told them to run at 95.
I think it's a pretty commonly observed thing. I think Rob Assisi from Illinois has also mentioned something very similar. Maybe not like PRs, but pretty darn close. And you tell them just to back off, like very, very close to 100%. If you look at the split times. So,
I had that with women's soccer too, like telling them, like you said, I didn't call it a technical fly, but it was like, hey, why don't you just focus on this like 1-2 things with posture? And I was like, I want you to just feel like you're really focusing on that and pumping that as hard as you can. But like, don't worry about it being your fastest ever. And we had girls legitimately hit like their best top speeds all off.
Yeah. And I view that as a win-win. I mean, obviously if the goal is to run fast that day, then you're running fast. And if the goal is to try to get them to be aware of a technical element that you're trying to fix, well, you're checking that box as well. So to me, it's a great way to train, especially I think with team sport athletes, although, we've started to sprinkle that in just in our few outdoor practices so far this year with Westchester sprinters as well. So,
yeah, I think that it ends up being overall very useful in a team sport setting, because we often have kids who are like, they want to try so hard. And it's sometimes like we have one kid on our football team who comes right to mind, because he would almost be like holding his breath and you could see veins in his neck. And it was like, hey man, I love the effort, but if we actually want to go faster, you need to breathe.
Yeah, it's literally just trying to muscle it, right? I think you see that a lot in football athletes in particular.
Yeah.
And that is just terrible for pelvic position, for posture and pelvic position. It just doesn't end up well.
Yeah.
So.
And I was thinking about like your wicket statement too, in relation to like soccer, with a population that's so backside and how aggressive they are in extension, like when they go to kick, and how that carries over when you actually ask them to sprint at top speed. So it's like trying to get them to run even moderately fast while stepping over a wicket. I can only imagine how bad it would get for at least like most of my girls. So it's like, don't even give them the opportunity to think about that. Just like, hey, here's like one technical thing I want you to think about while you run right now.
Yeah, I think, for every population that you may work with as a coach, you have to evaluate whether or not that's a drill that's going to, get good return on investment. That's really what it comes down to. I used to think in my early coaching days when I first came across wickets, which was about 10 years ago at this point, it's like, oh, you just set up the drill and it just takes care of everything, barely need to coach it, just takes care of everything else. And it's obviously that was a naive thought. It needs to be coached up and practiced just like everything else to get good mechanics to come out of it. But yeah, it's just about figuring out if it's right for your population. So
yeah. We even did, this was the last off season, January of 20. We had, when we were introducing our early on Max V stuff, we didn't have light enough med balls, so we ended up using PVC pipes, just as kind of like a forward counterbalance. I know Josh has posted about
the med ball punch run.
Yeah, and we didn't have light enough med balls, so we ended up just using the PVC just to have something in front. And we did that in wickets, and it went super well. But then in like breaking it down after and like being critical, we were like, was it the wickets or was it the constraint? So we're like, oh, we almost threw many. Our research design wasn't good, but but I mean the end result ended up being positive. So we're like, all right, but when we were breaking it down, we were like, so was the benefit from the forward constraint or the wickets more? So maybe we should have broken it down on each, but
well, you got more chances to do it, right? Every offseason that rolls around. So
absolutely. But yeah, do you like, the forward constraint like that? I mean, I found it's really useful.
Yeah, I use the med ball, the med ball punch run. Yeah, I use the med ball punch run. Yeah. We don't use it with our sprinters, but I think for team sport athletes, so I've used that not in like heavy doses, but at the end of the dynamic warm up. So, just do kind of like a traditional ramp, like Ian Jeffries, raise, activate, mobilize, potentiate, and then, just sprint drills after that, and then use it in sequence kind of towards the end of the sprint drill. So after like a march, a skip, a run, dribble, straight leg run, then the med ball punch run, and then, a few sub-maximal accelerations, and then technical flies. That's typically how I do my top speed days with team sport athletes. So the med ball punch run is definitely in there. No more than 2 reps. So I don't think I use it in heavy doses, and maybe I should use it more. I don't know. But yeah, I definitely like it. I think from my observations, it definitely eliminates backside thigh swing, like especially in team sport athletes who, have that problem. And it, of course, gives them a target to punch towards. This is interesting because it kind of brings us back towards our initial talking point of today, right? It's this happy medium of, in team sport athletes, and that's why that kind of Twitter clip was interesting. In team sport athletes, you still got to be doing everything you can to shift them front side and good pelvis, etc. It's really, if that starts to be what they look like when they sprint, that you have a problem. That they're like when they sprint all out, if they're just cycling in place, then it's probably gone too far. But I've never seen a team sport, like a team sport athlete, where that actually happens. I mean, from my experience, every team sport athlete you have, you almost have to overemphasize it at all times. So
yeah,
I like the med ball punch run.
Looking at something like the med ball punch run, the one time multiple times, but the one team I tried to implement it with, I almost found, and maybe it was the way I was cueing it, so I'd be curious on how you went about it, of like, they almost focused so much on trying to like actually drive to the med ball that their steps slowed down so much because it looked like they were trying to like prime time it and just get so much air time to actually hit the ball.
Yeah, let's see. I don't think I over cue it. I just have the athlete do it for 20 yards with a 10-yard decel afterwards. Start with the med ball a little bit in close to the chest and gradually extend it out over the course of the run, and just build it up from about 70% to 90% at the end to allow them to build a little momentum and extend the ball out a little further once they get going. So that really, like, the last 10 yards of it is where they've picked up a little bit of speed. And I actually keep the cue real simple. Just punch towards the ball. That's it. So occasionally I'll see a little bit leaning back posture. And so I think that watching from the side on that one, and just kind of seeing if they're leaning back too much to kind of keep the med ball up there is an issue. I think in that case, if that's the case, if that is happening, A, just cue it, or B, just give them a lighter med ball so that they don't have to lean back to counterbalance it. But
yeah. That's cool. All right, cool. So I guess a good transition for like things you see in sprinters that you don't really need to worry about in team sports is so a little bit different. But we were talking before about, I pulled up the graphic so I can get it correct. You put up a graphic. This is from 2014. This is the one I was thinking about from 2014 with you and Wayne, where you were comparing below average, good, national class, and world class sprinters. And this is kind of theoretical data, but it pretty much matches, like you said,
right.
when it ends up being. And you highlight in this average vertical force on the bottom, and it goes up basically
1/10 of a body weight, I believe.
Yeah, 1/10 of a body weight for every, basically average vertical force for national class, 420 pounds. And average vertical force world class 440. So
right.
It's in the tag is like a little bit of extra force equals a lot of extra speed. But the point that we were going to kind of dive into is that right above that is the one that jumped out to me immediately, is that 10-meter fly time. So for the world class, it's 10-meter fly is 0.83 and contact time is 0.083. And this matches up for all the different delineations of rank. Basically is that 10-meter fly time matches contact time, or contact time is just a decimal shifted over from of 10-meter fly. And that was fascinating, just seeing it and be like, oh, they literally match up. So I guess in team sport athletes, mushy ankles is probably the area where it's like, I mean, I've said pelvis is probably number one, just like getting some pelvic control. But then after that, it's like, coach, I got my 365-pound front squat and I weigh 180 pounds. Like, what's up? And then I would say number two after, or 1A, is the mushy ankle. And you see it show up when it's like, hey, you want to run fast? Like, you're not on the ground very long. And you need to be prepared to do that. And that doesn't just happen. Like, that's not something that happens by accident. Now, obviously, a fair amount of that is like, you get dudes who would just have Achilles that goes 75% all the way up to their knee, and that helps out. But I feel like that's not something that's gonna happen by accident unless you're intentional about it. It's like when you can go for both, like in sprinters and team sport athletes. But like, how do you go about addressing that that contact time specifically, kind of at the foot ankle complex?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting topic of conversation. And as you noted, the contact times, in a sense, don't change that much, right? I mean, the difference between 10 meters per second and 11 meters per second is, 9 milliseconds on
Yeah.
average. Just, if we take that theoretical data, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as you accurately noted, that is theoretical data. But if you take an average athlete with normal running mechanics, that's how those numbers play out.
Yeah.
So, yeah, a little difference in contact time goes a long way. Typically, everybody has this contact distance. That's the distance that their center of mass travels during ground contact of roughly their leg length. So for average height people, that's roughly a meter. So that's why the math plays out like that. It's contact distance divided by contact time gives you your velocity. So the kind of the numerical coincidences that you are noting there are not coincidences. So great observation. To your point about training and how do we affect change there, so it's a great question and it's a super important question. I would actually fully agree with your analysis that if you have a team sport athlete, probably the problem number one is pelvic control. It's a great way of putting it, right? But the problem, if that's 1A, then 1B is what's going on at foot ground contact for a bunch of different reasons. It could be a heavy lineman that's rear foot striking. It could be a soccer player that's striking too high on their toes. They run plantar flex a lot and they mush into the ground. Or it could be a football player that's ball of the foot, but when they strike, everything kind of collapses on top of that foot ankle. And so, I think it can be addressed a couple of different ways. I think some sort of barefoot training is important. I don't have the perfect protocol for that. We do some of that with our Westchester track and field athletes, both as part of their pre-workout or pre-warm-up activities, and also as part of their cool down. So we have almost some sort of barefoot training in every single day. And then I also think it's important to address it through plyometrics. I mean, just even the most basic of plyometrics, pogo hops, rudiment series, that sort of thing should be addressing that. And I think that a lot of times, Joel, to your comment, we address strength up the kinetic chain. Like what can you do in a bilateral stance, in a front squat, back squat, deadlift, whatever. But, and I always term that as, the engine that generates force. I mean, that's where force gets generated from, but where does it get transmitted? Well, it gets transmitted at the foot ankle ground complex, right? And so we do too much focus on the force generation, if you will, and not enough focus on the force transmission. What are we doing to strengthen where that force ultimately, gets transmitted to the ground, where the rubber hits the road, literally? It'd be like training a boxer and all you do is train the shoulder and the elbow and you never train the wrist. And so they're just, applying force with a limp wrist. And I mean, then it does you limited amount of good. So, as far as the barefoot type of training or how to train the intrinsic muscles of the foot and ankle complex, I have some ideas. I think probably a lot of coaches out there in the performance world, address that already. And I think just doing the simple things really well as far as plyometric training goes is the other way to help make sure that transfers. I see a lot of developmental athletes who just can't do the basic plyos well enough, even if that's just a pogo hop on one leg, right? Two legs, it looks okay, but suddenly you go to one leg and it's not as reactive as it should be, or it's not as stable or elastic as it should be. And I mean, from a speed standpoint, that's a problem, right? That's an area of weakness, since aside from block clearance, every other step after that's 3 to 5 times body weight on one leg in less than 1/10 of a second, hopefully, right? So I think that's my answer. I don't know if that's the right answer. That's my perspective, though, is try to address the the intrinsic foot and ankle strength, in the weight room, in the clinic, et cetera, and try to address the plyometric aspects of it, wherever plyos fit into your training program. So
Yeah.
Did I fully answer your question? I forget if I fully answered
No, absolutely.
all
That's
aspects.
great. Yeah, and I love the note on plyometrics too, because I even had this just a couple days ago with a girl on the lacrosse team where she was doing just a couple. She's like late stage rehab, like just about to hop back in, and was doing some 10-yard accelerations and was getting a little plantar flexed, and I was cueing on some of that, and she said, "Oh, like the pogos," and I was like,
Exactly.
So if nothing else, it
Provides context.
Exactly. It provides context where, because, if somebody's going to do a maximal 10-yard acceleration, they're not like, you almost can't volitionally be like, I'm going to pull my toes up. And,
Right.
You have to provide the context elsewhere. And they have to have some semblance of what that feels like and looks like, or, feels like both.
It's funny you mentioned that.
Yeah.
Sorry to interject. Yeah, because I
Go for it.
ironically use it in the same exact way. So I was doing a speed clinic about 2 weeks ago for some high school baseball athletes. They're between, I don't know, 14 and 17. So really developmental team sport kids. And, we were about to do a technical fly where this is the first time I'd worked with any of these athletes. We weren't going full speed because I didn't know what their, training background was. And so we were just going like 85, 90%. I was just kind of introducing the drill. I was like, it was our third one. I was like, all right, on this one, I just want you to go about 90%. And I just want you thinking about how you contact the ground. And, just kind of threw it out there. I was like, what part of the foot do you think you should strike the ground with? And, ball the foot. And I was like, yeah, but I need you to strike on the ball of the foot, but be reactive, like, really pop on and off the ground. So one of them asked, like, what does that mean? Which is a great question from a 14-year-old, right? I mean, reactive, what the hell does that mean? So, the obvious answer, and I should have thought of this before, was that, so we just did 2 sets of, pogo hops. It's on 2 legs. It's just like, all right, so guys, I just want you to, pretend like you're jumping rope, but you got no rope. Just balls to the feet, pop on and off the ground. And when you're in the air, pull the toes up, basically. And then it was just like that. After we did those 2 sets, it was like, okay, when you run this technical fly, when you run this build up, just strike the ground like you just struck it on those pogo hops. And yeah, I'm not saying it was perfect, far from it, but it's like you just said, Joel, if nothing else, it's a good way to provide context on what they need to be doing, when they sprint. So totally agree with you as far as a little anecdote you just told. So.
Yeah. It provides context. I could see it even being more beneficial in like in a soccer setting, like AC was talking about, where they are so used to being plantar flexed. And
I've noticed that with almost every soccer player I work with, they really are plantar flexed, which is understandable, but just from the way they play. Yeah,
they're very toe-y. Like the first time I'll ever have freshmen do pogos, it's like they're just doing a calf raise the whole time. They're not even like actually attacking the ground or anything like that.
Yep.
Yeah, cool. So shifting a little bit, we touched on it slightly beforehand, and this is an area where you've helped out on some studies, but weren't necessarily super involved, but you have some thoughts that we want to dive into on like where wearable resistance and, like, I guess light wearable resistance, relatively speaking, and where kind of that could go in terms of, where does it stand in the research? And then what are some maybe non-research level practical things that you're seeing or hearing about from practitioners about, some of the light wearable resistance, whether it's shank, thigh, or just kind of like, thorax.
Yeah. So I guess tracing back to some of our more recent research from the Westchester lab from October of 2020, published a study that really highlighted the importance of thigh angular velocity, how fast the thighs can rotate at top speed, and was pretty clear that was faster in our faster runners. We had a very heterogeneous database. We had track and field athletes, including a gold medal winner, actually. We had team sport athletes from Westchester, and we had recreationally trained athletes. So, you know, just kind of average Joes. So we had 20 males, 20 females, and pretty clear cut from the top speed that you know, a thigh angular velocity was directly correlated with how fast you can run. And you know, we think it affects how fast the limb ends up attacking the ground, which in turn affects how much force you can apply. And it's really nothing revolutionary there. I mean, there's been research on thigh angular velocity all the way back to Ralph Mann's work in the late 1980s. It was more just one of those things where we kind of directly investigated it and linked it to force application and said, hey, this is something that's been known, but maybe this is a more important variable than people have been, you know, paying attention to. Basically was the bottom line. So if you take that context, and simultaneously, as you mentioned, I've been lucky enough to be a part of several studies on thigh wearable resistance, and yeah, wasn't hands on the ground as far as the actual training part of those studies, but involved in the experimental design and data analysis and manuscript write up, et cetera. And I think there's good rationale to investigate wearable resistance either on the thigh or the shank because of the rotational overload that it provides. And there's other publications that I'm not a part of, but aware of from John Cronin, Ryu Nagahara, and some really respected biomechanists that have, you know, kind of outlined what we would all intuitively think, which is, hey, you put a, you know, weighted sleeve on your thigh, that's going to present a rotational overload, right? And maybe that's just common sense, but they've really kind of quantified that and I think done a really good job of it. And so it all aligns, I think, theoretically to say, okay, well, thigh angular velocity is important. This is a practical way in which you could overload that, not in like a weight room maneuver or something removed from the track, but you could overload that in an on-track or on-field type of activity. So it has a high degree of kind of organic value, if you will. And then, you know, say, okay, well, if we train like this for a period of time, does that improve that quality, which we know is linked to speed? And give a shout out to Erin Fieser, who's completing her PhD now at John Cronin, and I've been lucky enough to be a part of her committee. And she's kind of spearheading some of that research on the wearable resistance on the thigh and the shank. And so I think, you know, there's definitely a theoretical rationale for why that could be a viable training strategy. I think the research, the jury's still out a little bit just because it's relatively new. There's been a few studies of, you know, 10, 20 years ago, but as far as kind of this new wave of technology and how sleek it is and how you can really do basic sprint activities while wearing the resistance on the thigh or the shank, there needs to be kind of this new wave of investigations, which is ongoing. We'll see. I think there's a lot of potential. I think there needs to be, you know, a few more longitudinal studies to say, hey, this does actually help performance, or, you know, no, it's good in rationale, but, you know, it doesn't really help in practice. To me, that I think it holds promise. It definitely fits a mechanism for why for what should work. I think as far as the thorax resistance, ironically, that's how I got involved with research in the first place. My master's thesis in 2010, which is published in Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, we did resisted sprint training wearing heavy vests, pulling sleds, or just training without, and looked at top speed. And this was in Division III lacrosse players. And I guess thought that, you know, or I was pretty convinced that wearing a vest could potentially help. We did a 7-week training study because of the vertical overload that it was presenting. It did not help beyond that of the control group, which just did top speed training without any resistance. And in fact, the control group did better, ironically. The things in the resisted sprint world have come a long way since 2010. So, and, you know, and research builds upon itself. That's just the way it goes. In hindsight, I'm not sure if we had selected the proper loads to have those athletes wear. You know, it was good. We learned a lot, but, you know, from that study in particular, I can't say that wearing a weighted vest is beneficial beyond just kind of normal top speed training. I'll be interested to see if future research continues to look into that and, plays around with different loading conditions and comes to any different conclusions. But to tie a bow on the concept, yeah, I think wearable resistance is a really cool idea, because I do think that there's a theoretical rationale for it. And in practice, your athletes just wear the sleeve, and then they can just do all the normal training activities. It's not like you're having to, put on a harness and use a sled or whatever else. It's not like that's that big of a pain in the butt. But you know what I mean? It's not like, you're taking equipment on, putting equipment off. There, it's allows the athlete to be in a training session, and it's very user friendly, I guess you could say. So I think that it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the next couple of years. So
yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't heard of it. I mean, in terms of like the shank or the thigh, I hadn't heard of it in the terms of like overloading it from a angular velocity standpoint. I guess I'd only really been exposed to it. And we talked with Gabe Sanders about a year ago, and he was talking about it when he was at Stanford. He was wearing pretty light. I think it was under 5 pound vest, just to get some sort of vertical overload. But I hadn't heard of it. I mean, I think I'd seen like Joel Smith wearing some sort of shank or thigh. I think Stephon Jones, maybe with some of his cricket bowlers, was doing it. But I hadn't heard it in terms of the angular velocity, which is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that's what John Cronin and Ryu Nagahara, I think Paul McAdams' research looked at, and it provides, I believe in their terms, a rotational overload, right?
Yeah.
No different than any other resistive overload you would provide in the weight room, but something that could be viewed as very specific to developing, hip angular velocity, power, et cetera, with a very specific and targeted resistance.
Yeah.
So.
And just, I guess in my head, just to clear this up, is that like the angular velocity that super differentiated everybody? It's probably going to end up being both. But what did they primarily use, from blocked to ground contact, or was that from toe off to blocked?
Awesome question. Wow, I can honestly say in the 6 months since that study was published, I haven't yet been asked that question. That's a great question. Both. So we measured it in 3 different ways in that study. We measured it throughout the course of the entire gait cycle.
Mm-hmm.
So like basically the total range of motion throughout the gait cycle divided by the time. That was one way. We measured it during ground contact only. And then we measured it from block, so peak flexion to ground contact. And all 3 of them were significantly correlated. Both across the range of speeds. We did like some maximal and maximal trials. And then if you just honed in only on top speed trials, they were all significantly correlated. So I think you could look at it as being important in any way you slice it. From a force application standpoint, perhaps the most important way would be from block to contact, essentially. How aggressively they're attacking the ground.
Yeah, that makes sense. I figured it was both, because I mean, you're probably not going to see anybody who's at an elite level from block to contact and then be slow on the opposite way. So
well, the cool thing is you really can't, and this is not to get too much into the nerdy weeds, but you can't, because the legs work like scissors. So if it's coming down fast here, the other leg has to be recovering fast. Otherwise you turn in circles almost. So it's a pretty neat mechanism. So
yeah. So I mean, with that kind of the switching or scissoring action of that,
exactly.
where it's most visible is when you're in like true flight, and where you're not applying any force, you're not touching anything. I mean, you're in flight. That sort of action, which is so specific, where do you see like the difference between people who are high level at that specific action versus not? Like, how would you go about like, all right, this person is, all other things considered, pretty decent, but they're just lacking in that switching action. Like, what are some things that you see that hold people back in that area? And then how would you potentially address them? I mean, in a broad sense. That's
the $1 million question. And when I figure that out in 5 years, I'll get back to you. And I'll be a much better coach at that point. No, that's a great question. That is, really the big follow-up to that is, okay, this is important. How can we go about improving this in our athletes? It's easier for me to see and cue an acceleration. So I'll give you this example. We see this a lot in our athletes at Westchester. So we're trying to teach them to project out of the blocks and their start in step 1 and step 2, right? And so, maybe at first, like if they're freshmen or sophomores, when they first come to us, they're not pushing enough, they're not getting big enough splits. So our first step is saying, hey, you got to apply force. So you got to get bigger splits, bigger pushes. But then once they've achieved that, once they've started to figure out how to project and push, the next thing that we start to see is they get this big split, kind of what we term the Google image photo. If you type into Google image sprinting, you see this guy with these big splits, right? They get there, but now they just hang it in midair. So their thighs are, they get these huge splits. One thigh's really flexed in front of them. One thigh's really extended back behind them. And now there's kind of this almost a pause, this momentary pause, and they're not reversing it and getting back down to the ground. So that's when we really see it and cue it. And it's literally just what I just said. It's like, hey, you're getting a big split. That's great. But you got to reverse it and immediately attack the ground. And we do see that sometimes with our USA track and field athletes as well, which is, we're going through the slow motion video with them at the start, and we see a nice split in step, block clearance or step 1. But then the thigh is just kind of floating up in front of them for just a few frames too many. And you got to hit that big flexion and then immediately reverse it back to the ground. You could make the same comment at top speed, but it's just so much harder to see with the naked coaching eye because, things are just cycling, at such a fast rate. It's at least my coaching eye certainly can't pick that up. So we do address that a lot in acceleration. As far as how to improve that at top speed, I don't know. Definitely something that I'm interested in looking into moving forward, which is saying, okay, we're starting to get a handle on how to quantify this. What do you do with that? If it's not, if that magnitude of that value is not where it needs to be, can you improve it? I mean, we don't even really know if you can improve it, but if so, what are the best ways to go about it? All we really know at this point is, hey, in fast people, generally speaking, that's great. The ability to do that is greater than in slower people, but affecting change is really kind of the next step in the process from both a research and a coaching standpoint, I think.
Yeah, that's awesome. And even too, like I'm thinking about that in an acceleration standpoint from team sport athletes, like providing the context of feeling that like switch, even though it's intentionally much slower and you exaggerate the flexion in front. When we've introduced speed bounds, that's been an area where some people have been like, oh, okay, I feel that, even though it's obviously intentionally more in front and it's almost the opposite. Like you're almost delaying.
No, but I know what you're saying. I love bounding and speed bounding. I think it's just a tremendous exercise for any number of reasons. The force application, the limb coordination, how the shin and thigh kind of need to work in harmony on the front side to get the thigh up in front, and then kind of like you just said, once you get to that position, just kind of getting the athlete aware of, okay, from this position, how I gotta attack the ground basically. So yeah, I think those are great speed bounding and bounding are great exercises for athletes, provided they're progressed appropriately. So
yeah, no doubt. Sweet. Awesome. Well, this is right at about an hour, so we can wrap up. I really enjoyed this, Ken. This was we were excited for this for a while and did not disappoint. So thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Give a little shout out if you have any questions, you want to get a hold of me, you can reach out to me at Ken Clark Speed on social media. And then about 6 months ago at this point, launched a website, which is kenclarkspeed.com. You can get a hold of me through there on email, or also just kind of follow that for research updates, coaching updates, etc.
Sweet. Yeah, we'll make sure to link those in the show notes for you.
Great. Well,
Awesome.
thanks, guys. Really appreciate you having me on. Always love talking speed, and this was a pleasure.
Absolutely.
Thanks a ton.